Fantastic. Thank you very much. Yeah, that was very kind. It was actually the exactly correct amount of applause, which like a lot of audiences get wrong, and I find it kind of embarrassing. So I'm really pleased you nailed that. Thank you. It is good. I mean, yeah, I kind of needed it. I feel a little self-conscious, if I'm honest. I'm on telly. Like I can't see myself. I look away as soon as I look. It's weird. But also like I used to put a lot of effort into these gigs before COVID, get really dressed up, all my smartest shoes and stuff, but today I've come dressed as myself, which has never historically been a good choice for me, so I'm a little, but honestly, I'm kind of used to it. Like I've been anxious my entire life, really. I mean, not constantly. There's times I've been asleep or watching The Vicar of Dibley, I don't know if you remember, like, that was good. But in general, I've just been always pretty nervous. Like, as a child, I was very nervous around fish fingers. And then as I grew up, it just became obvious that worrying was my main way of relating to the world. Like whatever I had to do, I'd worry about it. And then I'd worry about the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And it was like, I don't know, my life was just this like conveyor belt of worry. Like my ongoing dream was just to have different problems to worry about. I'd be like, oh, I can't wait for next week when I'll be worried about that instead. And that was it. And most of the time this wasn't a problem. I just thought, I'm a natural worrier. And if anything, it was good to have something I was good at, But there was these times when it would spike out of all control. I'd have these days or weeks or months sometimes where I'd just be afraid all the time. I'd just be constantly anxious. And I didn't really understand this. I didn't know what it was about. And I'm quite scientifically minded, so I tried looking for patterns, like trying to understand why I was anxious and what it was. But most of the time, I couldn't even tell you what I was anxious about. It just seemed to be everything. Like it was just a kind of constant sense of general doom. Like other times, I'd be like really focused on some very specific doom. I'd be like really worried about like a plague or a building collapse or a referendum. Just awful things. But later on, I'd feel fine about whatever it was I was worried about. And I kind of realized it's not the thing that's worrying me, it's something else. But I never really got to the bottom of it. Very often it'd be health anxiety, actually. I'd be convinced I was sick. In reality, pretty much the worst thing that actually happened during this period is I developed an allergy to apples, which is true. It's mildly embarrassing, but true. Although, actually, while I have this platform, can I just say, apple allergy is another condition that does not get the respect it deserves. Like, I did make it worse, obviously. I tried to handle the health anxiety with the old advice, an apple a day keeps the doctor away. But like I said, I didn't understand this anxiety. I didn't understand what it was about. So when it went away, I didn't do anything about it. I just tried to avoid everything that was making me anxious. And because that could be anything, I just started avoiding all kinds of things. I started shrinking my world down. I started saying no when my friends invited me out. And it wasn't all the time, but it just seemed easier to hide. And over time, over years of this, I didn't engage really with the problem. And eventually, obviously, I hit this real low. I hit this sort of spike of anxiety that came and it stayed for over a year. And I was just, for every day, for a long, long time, I was falling apart. I was afraid. I'd wake up afraid. I'd go to work and I'd sit there afraid if I was going to feel later. And I'd lie awake at night worrying about how I was going to feel the next day. And then I'd go to work and the whole cycle would repeat. And it just went on and on and on. And it was just inescapable. Like, those times when Piers Morgan is on like every TV channel. Like, it just felt the same kind of inescapable fear and lack of safety. And honestly, there was points during this year where I was mostly afraid I was going to feel like this forever, that I was now doomed to just be anxious forever. And there were points where I thought the only way to stop feeling like this would be suicide. It's very cheery, this bit, isn't it? It's always a real crowd pleaser. But, I want to be honest, and not to spoil the end, I didn't go through with it. But it is weird. Like, even years later, like I've written a book about this, and I go around giving talks about it and sharing, but there's still this part of my brain that's like, you can't talk about this. Like, you shouldn't talk about this. You'll make people feel bad, or you'll look bad, and you'll look weak. And I was really like that at the time. I've got this picture of me at the time. It's not the best photo, but as you can see, I looked strong, impressive, powerful. Although if you do look closely, you'll see I seem to have devastatingly broken my spine, which could have been at the root of some of the problems, I'm not sure. But the point is that at the time, no one knew about this. None of my friends, none of my family, they didn't know I was going through every day just in this dark place. And actually, to the extent to which it had taken me to these dark places, I just put up a front. And from outside, I think my life looked probably fine. Not amazing, but fine. I had a good job. I was dating. I was doing stand-up comedy. From outside, I probably looked confident and like everything was together. But inside, I was in this kind of completely falling apart. And that's a problem, obviously. I mean, it was a problem for me because it meant I couldn't get any help. If no one knew I needed help, how were they going to help me? But it's a problem for everyone too, because if we all put up a front, then everyone struggles on their own. If you imagine a world where everyone felt like that but didn't let on, everyone would think it was just them. So I'm trying to be more open, both in my private life and in public like this. Although, obviously, this is going far too far. I really don't think we all need to go around giving talks about our emotional problems. I don't think that's a world that we want to live in. But just finding a place to kind of share openly about how we're feeling is really important. But there were other reasons it was hard to share when I look back. And at first, I didn't even realize it was anxiety. And that sounds completely stupid, right? Like I was anxious the whole time. Like, what is that? But anxiety was a word I kind of applied to other people. I just didn't think I had it. And I really thought that everyone felt like that. I thought it was normal that everyone went through the day feeling like I did, and they were just better at being human than I was. I always remember going to the opticians when I was 12, like not for anxiety. I'm not a complete fool. It was, an eye test, right? And there was this moment when they put glasses on me for the first time, and I could suddenly see across the road into the Asda, and I was just like, wow. I mean, again, I've seen Asdas before, it wasn't that spectacular. It was just the fact that it was now sharp. I could read the signs, and up until that point, I think there was part of me that had always believed the world was blurry. Like I thought everyone else was just better than me at reading squiggles and turning them into words. And it was like that with anxiety. I just thought everyone was in the same sort of emotional state, and they were just better than me at handling it. So, I didn't want to let on because I was very proud about it myself, and I didn't realize what was going on. And even when I did sort of accept, oh, that's what anxiety means, that's what I'm experiencing, I didn't understand the cause. I didn't really grasp what to do about it. For a long time, I thought there was something else was wrong. I thought it was something physical. I thought there was something wrong with my body. Obviously, I now recognize it's flawless. So thank you for only slightly laughing at that, Manchester. I appreciate it. But like I said, I had health anxiety for a long time. I was convinced that if I could just sort out whatever's wrong with my body, then these anxious feelings would go away. And that took me down all kinds of lines. My doctor was very good. We had tests and investigations, and it kind of culminated in what I came to think of as a surprise endoscopy. But we can leave that as a story for another day. The upshot is that eventually I accepted, okay, that's not the problem here. It's something else is wrong. And that was the point where I finally sort of took action, And in a way, it was really helpful that I'd hit that intolerable low period, because it finally provided motivation for me to do something about it and to go and actually change things. Like I just would do anything to not feel like that again. So I did everything. Like I was very open-minded. I was like, right, anxiety, I'm going to tackle this as hard as I can. I went and read every book I could. I went to therapy. I was talking about my emotions. I went and meditated. I went on those weird weekends you can go on where you sit around in a circle with strangers and, you get taught to breathe in a certain way that helps you relive your past traumas. That was a fun one. I was just very open-minded. I was willing to try anything. And through all of this, I started to learn loads of things about myself, and it started to come together. I started to piece things into place. And in the end, I hit on an image which sort of summed up the whole journey and sort of solved anxiety for me. And it probably won't surprise you to know that the answer to anxiety turned out to lie in advanced fluid dynamics. So it's a real mixture of emotions, like there's some amusement, there's some horror. Some people were happy when I was talking about suicide than when I'm talking about maths. But I can tell you're a smart crowd, and you're all clearly thinking, Neil, those are the Navier-Stokes equations which describe how liquids move. So we won't bother revising the maths because you're all clearly on top of it. Instead, I want to talk about a consequence of these equations, which is that you can divide all the liquids in the world into two groups, which is quite a fun game if you've got nothing better to do with your time and a lot of liquid. The These groups are called Newtonian and non-Newtonian fluids, and they describe how liquids behave in the presence of an outside force. In other words, we're answering the classic scientific question, what happens if I hit it? If you hit a Newtonian fluid, like for example, water, it's kind of obvious what happens. It splashes, soaks everything in sight, and generally I get asked to stop. But if you hit a non-Newtonian fluid, like for example, popular pudding sauce custard, it behaves differently. Instead of splashing apart, it clumps up together, hardening temporarily before it relaxes back to its previous state. So in other words, if I punch custard for my own personal reasons, then it hardens. Now, it is important to have a quick disclaimer. This does depend on the exact recipe you use and the custard, etc., blah, 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 but who cares? This means you can do really awesome things. Like you can fill a swimming pool with custard and walk on it. How cool is that? It's like a biblical miracle, except even more sugary. And I mean, we have to use imagination here, people. Like, I want to say that I'm walking on custard, and I am the kind of person who would bring a pool full of custard to a conference and run around on it for your entertainment. But I'm also the kind of person who thinks that's quite a lot of faff. So we have to use our imaginations. And you can walk on custard, and I thought about it a lot, like much more than anyone reasonably should. And one thing I realized about it is there's a huge problem, which is that once you start, you can't stop. Like every time my foot hits the surface, it hardens. But if I pause to try and enjoy it, then it's going to turn back into a liquid, and I'm going to sink and drown in custard, which is definitely in the top 3 most embarrassing ways to die that there is. Oh, I'm knackered now talking about embarrassment. The reason I thought about this so much is that for a long time, this is what my life felt like. Like I really felt like I was just running and running and running every day just to try and stay afloat in my own life. There was this fear that if I didn't put in all this effort, if I didn't do all this exactly right, if I didn't keep holding on to whatever it was I was holding on to, that the ground underneath me was unsafe and that I was going to die. This was the feeling of running around on top of custard. And I started looking for a way not to do that, a way off the custard and to get onto solid ground, a place where I could just be at peace and live my life like other people seem to be able to. And as I sort of shared this image with people, they've said that it feels resonant with them, it feels common, like that there are times that we're going through life and it feels like the ground underneath us is unsafe and that we're sort of not on emotional solid ground. So, this is all well and good, right? It's a nice image to understand anxiety and our emotions, but it would obviously be a lot more useful if I could tell you what to do, If you're out there on this custard, how do you get from there to solid ground? How do you live your life at more emotional peace? And I'd love to give you the one weird trick that solves anxiety forever, but obviously it's not quite that simple. We all have a different mix that makes up our anxiety and the solutions are different too. But I'm very quickly going to share some ideas that I feel would have helped me a lot at the time and hopefully will help us all just understand our emotions a little bit better. And the first thing I want to suggest is about what the goal of a happy life is. Because I think for a long time, I had this sense that my goal, that the way I should be living is some state of constant happiness. I thought that if I'm constantly happy, things are good. If I'm not constantly happy, something's wrong, that needs to be fixed. And I think that that's not quite correct. I think that actually we should be aiming for emotions to be in tune with reality. So it's not about happiness, it's about being in tune with whatever's actually happening. Because there's nothing actually wrong with feeling anxious. If I'm being chased by a wolf, or if I'm in Stockport, then I should be anxious. Popular town to pick in Manchester, that was a good choice. If I'm being chased by a wolf, then I should feel anxious. The anxiety is what propels me to get away. It's what propels me to change my situation. The problem is when there's no wolf, but it feels like there is. So it's when our emotions are not in tune with reality, we've got a problem. And this goes for other emotions too. If we're feeling, sadness, but it's not corresponding with what's happening, or disproportionate anger, or disproportionate paranoia, even disproportionate happiness. If I'm in a room that's on fire and I'm like, oh, this is brilliant, I love this, that's obviously a problem. Happiness isn't always the right response to any situation. Some situations are bad, and we should feel bad in those situations because that's what inspires us to change them and make the situation better, or to leave. So aiming to have our emotions in tune with reality would have really helped me. Another thing that would have helped is understanding where my emotions were even coming from, because at the time, it felt very much like they just came from everywhere. I had no sense of what was causing them. It was like anxiety was just this torrent that appeared and knocked me over, and I didn't have a clue what it was about. And I think looking back, it would have really helped me to divide all the different sources of emotions into 3 different groups. So the first one, I think, is that emotions can come from the universe, right? And I don't mean in like some kind of cosmic space sense. I just mean the actual physical universe that we live in, like all of our life circumstances. So this is our jobs, our relationships, our friends, exams, dogs, carbon monoxide, yogurt, like everything that exists in the world that we can have an emotional reaction to. And I think I had a strong tendency to focus on this for a long time. I thought that if I can just get the universe right, then I'll be okay. If I can change my job to do a better job, move house, get a better relationship, sort this out, then I'll be fine. And obviously, this is a real source of emotions. Like we want to improve our circumstances, and sometimes we're in bad circumstances. But it's not the only source. I was neglecting these other ones. One thing I neglected for a long time was the physical source of emotions. And this, I think, is everything in our bodies. So, am I sick? Because we do feel worse when we're sick. Like, it's a legitimate emotional reaction. Have I been getting enough sleep? Have I been looking after myself? What are the chemicals doing, my brain? All this kind of stuff. And for a long time, I thought, oh, maybe that's it. Maybe the brain chemicals are out of balance. Maybe I'm not eating the right food. Maybe I'm not exercising enough. And, all those things are probably true to an extent. Again, this is real, and it is a legitimate source of emotions, but it's not the only one. And the one that I neglected the most was the mental side. And this is our thoughts and our feelings, and our thoughts about our feelings, and our feelings about our thoughts, and all the different ways that those things kind of play off each other to create our internal experience. And I think for a long time, I just sort of thought this happened automatically and would take care of itself. And for me, this was very much the root source of a lot of my anxiety. And I spent a lot of effort trying to fix the first 2, which is legitimate and real, but I neglected this third one. So I want to focus on this third one just for this last bit to give some tips about the mental side of things. Because I think if I said to you, how would you improve your life circumstances? Or how could you look after yourself physically better? We'd all have some idea. We could come up with some things we could do. But if I said, how would you improve your management of your thoughts and feelings? I think it's not as easy. I think we're less knowledgeable about how to do that. So I want to talk about that really quickly. And I'm going to do it by talking about Custard. So I started noticing these mental patterns that I kept falling into, and I started thinking of them as custard traps. And these are like unhelpful mental habits that were causing my anxiety or making it worse. And calling them custard traps was actually really handy in itself because it separated me from the anxiety. It wasn't like I am anxious or I have anxiety, like it's a disease that I've got. It was, I've fallen into this custard trap. I was over here chilling out, and now I'm on the custard for a bit, and I can get out. It's an experience that I'm having, not part of me. And I noticed that these traps, these mental habits, shared some features. And the most important one is that they're self-reinforcing. Being on the trap, being caught in a custard trap, pushes you to stay in the trap. They're quite devious like that. Incidentally, Devious Custard is the name of my rapper alter ego. Do check that out if you get a moment. But that's not important right now. So let me give you an example. One custard trap that I often fell into was asking why. Why am I anxious? And on the surface, that seems like a really reasonable thing to do. It's like if I can understand the anxiety, I can do something about it. But here's what would actually happen. I'd feel anxious, and I'd think, why am I anxious? And then my brain would be like, oh, well, maybe you're sick. Maybe you've been poisoned. Maybe it's nuclear war. Maybe everyone secretly hates you. Did you ever think about that? Maybe you're a massive failure and you're doomed to, you can see what's happening here. My brain is really good at coming up with things to worry about. So if I say, why am I anxious to myself? I can come up with an infinitely long list of things, and then each one of those is going to start making me feel anxious as I think about them and try and figure out, is it that one, is it not that one? And I'm in this rabbit hole and I'm stuck. I've been pulled into this custard trap. So the key point about this isn't that asking why is bad. It's that my coping strategy was part of the problem, and I didn't notice this. And this happens a lot when we start looking for it. Like when we're really struggling with something, it's often that our coping strategy is giving us more of the same problem. And these things, they often show up in the form of a cycle. Sorry, that's embarrassing. These things often show up in the form of a cycle. Correct amount of laughter. It's not a good joke. Like, for example, I was anxious for a long time, and that made me ill. And then I was anxious about being ill, because that was horrible. And then that made me more anxious, which made me more ill, which made me more anxious. And this was like a long, slow trap that took place over months and months, whereas asking why could happen in just minutes. So these things are different sizes, but it's about looking out for these loops that we can get stuck in. And it sounds easy enough, right? You think, oh, I'll just recognize the loop that's happening in my brain and I'll just get out of it. But actually, another feature of these is they're really hard to spot. They're often invisible from inside. And partly this is because everything we do becomes normal. Our brains are amazing at normalizing things. There's this guy, George Stratton. He's a scientist, and he did an experiment where he wore glasses that flipped his vision upside down. And after a few days of wearing these glasses, everything started to look the right way up. And then when he took the glasses off, things looked upside down just through his normal eyes. Isn't that amazing? Like, a few days of wearing these glasses changed the way his brain interpreted his vision. Our brains are constantly trying to make things normal. And you see this in everyday life. If you decorate a room or move some furniture around, the first few times you walk in, you really notice it. You're like, oh, that's different. But obviously it fades into the background after not very long. Our brains just make it normal, which is good, right? You don't want to walk into a room and be astonished that someone moved a sofa in 1995. We have to make these things normal. But we do this with everything, including our mental habits and including things that might be dragging us down. So one example of this for me is that I was constantly thinking of the worst thing that could happen, and I didn't notice I was doing it. I'd just be sitting there in the cinema with my friends or whatever, and my brain would just be chewing away on things that might go wrong, And it could be a huge deal, it could be a small deal, but I'd just be fantasizing about all these bad things, but I wouldn't notice I was doing it. The first time I'd become aware is when I suddenly feel anxious. And then I'd be like, oh, anxiety again. Oh no, it's happening again. Why am I anxious? And then I'd have my list, and then there we go. I'm in the cycle, and I'm like, oh, I'm having a panic attack in the cinema again. Brilliant. And I wouldn't know why any of that had happened. And it took a long time of learning to make these things visible, to recognize the mental habits that were happening in my brain. Because obviously, once we know what's happening, it becomes a lot easier to change it. But until you know, it's almost impossible. So the first thing I had to do was just to pay attention, to really start learning what's happening in my brain. I had to notice where my feelings have come from, what have I been thinking about, how did that make me feel? And people do this in all kinds of different ways. This is why meditation is so useful. It gets you just used to watching what's happening inside your mind. People journal, people just talk about their emotions more. But even just checking in from time to time and just like, why am I thinking this? What did I just think? How did it make me feel? Just getting a little habit of noticing what's happening makes a huge difference. Because once we know we're doing this, we can start reacting differently. We can recognize, okay, this is not a helpful set of thoughts to me. I need to do something different. Because these cycles are very ingrained. My natural reaction is to stay on the cycle. That's what makes it a cycle in the first place. So I had to start building a habit of doing something different as soon as I noticed I was in these. Like, my natural reaction is to be anxious about my anxiety, which just pours more fuel on the fire. And these feedback loops is what turns like a normal emotion into an overwhelming emotion. If you're sad about being sad, if you're angry about being angry, that's when we start to really blow out of all control. So what I started to do was, when I recognized myself falling into these custard traps, I'd recognize the feeling. There'd be like a little fizz in the brain, a little stab in the chest, or certain situational triggers that I knew would set off my anxiety. I had like a list of positive things to do instead, and I would just go do something off that list. I'm falling into a trap. I'm going to go drink a glass of water or phone a friend, sing the Danish national anthem, relive a sporting triumph. Obviously not one of mine, just one I'm seeing, but it doesn't matter. The point is, rather than following that loop and getting stuck in the trap, I would be doing something else. I'd be breaking the cycle and just training myself to escape that trap and get back onto solid ground as fast as possible. So it's not about eliminating that anxiety. It's just about learning to deal with it better. Because over time, we just practice that skill. Quite recently, I had this bad spike of anxiety out of nowhere. I just suddenly felt awful. And instead of reacting as I would have reacted some years ago and being, oh my God, I'm anxious, it's all happening again, panic, I just thought, oh, anxiety, cool. I felt that before, and I just sort of sat for a minute, didn't particularly think about it, and it went away. And I've got no idea what caused it, but I also don't care. I was just following my kind of habit of letting it pass and not blowing it up into something bigger. So there's a lot more I'd like to say. I would normally go on for hours, as I'm sure you can imagine. But in this session, I just wanted to give this quite simple message. We all struggle from time to time. It is very normal. And even if we think we're the only ones feeling a certain way, we probably aren't. And I think a good goal is to aim to have our emotions be in tune with reality. And when we're struggling, remember those three things. Because when we're anxious, it's not obvious what is the cause. So I think having those ideas of, okay, I'm going to try and improve my life circumstances just a little bit, maybe even it's just tidying up or feeling better about my environment. I'm going to try and improve my physical side a little bit. I'll try and get an extra hour's sleep or something, something little. And I'm going to try and just pay more attention to what's happening in my mind and really just keep an eye out for these cycles we get stuck in. And between all of those, we'll probably hit on some things that just help us live a little bit more on solid ground, a little bit less on custard. And I realize that this is almost insultingly simple when you put it like all of this, but it kind of has to be, because when you are in those difficult circumstances, when you're stuck on the custard for a long period of time, so much of your energy is going on just getting through the day. You're just constantly trying to stay afloat, and any kind of complex solution just seems like too much. So just these little things of trying to improve those three things a little bit, checking in a little bit more, trying to break out of these cycles, and over time, we can all hopefully get better at not living on custard and instead living on solid ground, and hopefully sharing with each other and supporting each other through these journeys. So that is everything I was going to say today. If you want to know more, I do have a website. I'm very bad at plugging things, but neilhughes.me, do check it out. And there's a book I've written about it as well. So there's some links there, and come talk to me about it if you're interested. Sorry, plugging makes me feel really awkward. I suddenly had a moment of, oh dear, but it's allowed. So thank you very much for listening. I've really enjoyed sharing it. I hope it's useful to you. And I hope you enjoy custard in a kind of edible form, but not an emotional one from now on. Thank you very much.